It's definitely summer, and it's been a really strange few weeks with the Delta virus surging, and just as we were thinking we might be safe again. But tonight we're going to forget all that and continue our 20th anniversary year celebration with one of our favorite poets, Didi Jackson, and her debut poetry collection, Moonjar. The book explores the life-altering and heart-rending loss of a husband in 2011 to suicide, the subsequent grieving process, and rediscovering love. Didi will be in conversation tonight with former poet laureate, state poet laureate, Chard Denord. And since it's 900 degrees outside, I'm enjoying a really well-chilled glass of Pinot Grigio. What is everyone else drinking?
Red wine with ice in it.
That's good too.
my mom would be proud of that one too. Gin and tonic.
Do we have a survey?
There's the survey.
Oh, okay. Maybe we should have put water on there.
Yeah.
Maybe the survey will give people ideas even. Mocktail mango mule.
If you hear a faint knocking nearby, it's the woodpecker at our feeder here. So.
Oh, I love woodpeckers.
Yeah.
Although they're obnoxiously noisy, but they're still fun. All right. So, Didi Jackson is the author of Moonjar. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, Kenyon Review, the New England Review, Plowshares, and elsewhere. Jackson's poems have been selected for the Best American Poetry Series and Poem a Day by the Academy of American Poets. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee now, sadly, with her husband Major, and serves as a visiting assistant professor of creative writing at Vanderbilt University. Chard Denord is the author of 7 books of poetry, including his latest, In My Unknowing. Denord has also authored 2 books of interviews with the renowned American poets, Sad Friends, Drowned Lovers, and Staple Songs, and I Would Lie to You If I Could. Denord is the former poet laureate of Vermont, and he lives in Westminster West with his wife, Liz. If you have questions for either Didi or Chard, enter them at the Q&A button. If the question is already up there, then upvote the question and it will move up. So welcome, Didi and Chard.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you, Sandy. It's wonderful to be here. Welcome, Didi. Glad you're back in Vermont this summer. So you moved back here from Nashville in the summer to your home up in Rochester, Vermont. So wonderful to welcome you back here. Let's start with a poem, if you don't mind. Maybe one that you've written recently or published recently that you would like to read and pertains to what we're going to be talking about today a little bit.
Sure. We are in Rochester, and thank you. And thank you, Sandy and Jerry, who's behind the scenes. I thought I would read a poem that I wrote that's based near, during the pandemic, I was writing a lot about Rochester and this area, of course, because we were, here, and we were not going very far outside of our immediate surrounding areas. So this one, I thought it would be nice to start off sort of soft with. Let's see. Just get to it. Sorry, I thought I had it up. There we go. Mercy. I prefer the charred smell of old fire rings, tattooed evidence of laughter, like the kingfishers rattle at the water's edge, the shoreline, the pallor of my skin. Who am I to be witness to the infinite number of jays winging down the mountain, blue beads weaving in and out of pine and beech, jeweled and brilliant? The air itself is their memory. There is no freedom like that. The mountains are multiple continents. How do I pray to anything larger than this? Everything is of me and so much greater than me. And why quit this place? Birch branches softly drum my name. And when I say quit, I mean intentionally, as with blades or guns, pills even. Miracles fall everywhere like loose leaves. A ghost rests in my arms and I rock him for a moment as he remembers what was good, the cool nights, the warmth of campfires, the mercy that strips us naked to each other.
Thank you, Didi. I would love you to read a few more during our time, but maybe I'd like to start with a question, just a kind of basic question about how writing Moonjar, which is the title of your new book, wonderful new book, sort of help you manage to deal with, process the grief you felt following your first husband's death.
Sure. So I was teaching art history actually when he died. And so art, and I was writing poetry. And so the arts, both poetry, visual art. I also danced when I was younger. I was a dancer in college. I've always believed in the catharsis of art. That said, I didn't really know how I was going to move through such an unexpected tragedy in my life. I wasn't sure about that. And early on, a very good friend of mine, Michelle, who's an amazing poet as well, Michelle Randall Parker, she came and I couldn't write. You know, I couldn't put down to words. It felt, I wouldn't say useless, but pointless. And so she just had me very slowly cut pictures out of magazines, something just very basic, something almost very, elementary, something I remember doing in kindergarten. And so it was that basic movement that was kind of starting to bring me back into wanting to create. And then I slowly wanted to put words down, and then those words slowly turned into poems. The poems early on were very cryptic. I felt very self-conscious about saying the word suicide out loud. I didn't think that anybody should or could hear that word. I thought by me spreading that word would be spreading suicide in some strange way, in the way, however my mind was working at that time. So, but eventually the big turning point for me came when I got brave enough to start reading some of the poems out loud in certain places and venues, and some of the poems started getting published. And people would come up and say, I need that poem. I know somebody who needs that poem. I know somebody who went through this. I too have gone through this. And so hearing people's stories encouraged me to continue to write and write my own. And then it was also advice was given to me early on to stop at the cryptic. Like, I don't tend to be super cryptic in this book. I tend to want to say it, say and talk openly about it, because that was counter to what I felt initially. Initially, I didn't want to do that. Initially, I felt it was bad. I was ashamed. I felt shame for my husband. I felt worried and wanted protective of him. And then I realized how many other people must be in that same dark place. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know that you are a big fan of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where grief plays such an important role after Gilgamesh loses his beloved friend Enkidu. And there's this wonderful translation by Herbert Mason. I think I've recited some of it to you before. Reading your book just reminded me so much of this quote. It begins with, all that is left to one who grieves is convalescence, no change of heart or spiritual conversion. For the heart has changed and the spirit has converted to a thing that sees how much it costs to lose a friend it loved. And he goes on, interestingly, to talk about grief as this phenomenon that one can only experience alone. So you've been presented as a poet with this difficult task of trying to communicate through language your experience, and mainly it's with a lot of figurative speech, a lot of metaphors and so forth, to kind of break through that wall. And I'm wondering if maybe there's a poem that manifests or exemplifies that kind of breakthrough. I was thinking of the poem "Kill Lies All," or some other poems as well, but that one just kind of stuck out to me when I read it. And
Sure.
I'd love to know what you mean by that as well, that phrase.
Sure. I am really struck by those lines from Gilgamesh. I too have my own favorite section of Gilgamesh, and I would love to mention that in just a second. But I think in the lines that you were mentioning, that section, it's mentioned that we do experience grief alone. It's also this private moment with the dead. Like grief is our only private moment with the dead in a way. So it's like I thought that was just really struck me hard a couple of days ago. I was really thinking more about this, and I was thinking, wow, that's through grief we have our private moment with the person that we are grieving, the dead. But it's also interesting to me that grief is the subject of these ancient texts, right? So Gilgamesh is coming to terms with his mortality, right? That he will be mortal, that we're all mortal, and what are you going to leave?
Right.
The section that I love is the section about mayflies. I used to read it to my students every year. I would read this prior to my husband's suicide. And then after my husband's suicide, the first time I went to read it, I couldn't make it through that section out loud. I got choked up a little bit because the truth of the lines were true to me before, but they had such weight of truth, after experiencing that level of grief. So the idea that our life is fleeting, and life is, that's the idea of this, right? Like that we're here and then we're not. And I try to, that's a subject that I think also is really important in my next book. It's about this balance of life and death, how we're constantly walking in life next to death. But so Gilgamesh, I think of even the Iliad. One of my favorite ways to approach the Iliad is through the Achilles grief for Patroclus, like the grief that he goes through, and then the mourning that. So I think grief has just been it's been something that we've been interested as humans to talk about. And so it's funny that it's about privacy, our grief, but we're writing these big texts, right, that have been shared since the beginning of time. Yeah. So and interesting. So Picasso is expressing in Guernica his own expression of grief for the city Guernica that's bombed, and just before World War II, by the Germans, who are practicing their their bombing techniques and their air flights, and they basically destroyed the city. And then he paints that giant painting, Guernica. And then Guernica was graffitied. The painting was graffitied. I forget what year off the top of my head. I would have known it, but it was graffiti. It was spray painted, "Kill Lies All." And so it's an interesting, weird grammar alignment, kill. I think I even actually miswrote it at one point when I was early versions of the poem. I had kill all lies, because that seems to make more sense. But visual art plays a super important role, just from being an art history teacher, and I often conflate my own stories with visual arts. In poetry, I'll say, oh, that poem is like a Frida Kahlo painting, or that poem is like a Mark Rothko, so it's interesting how that happens. So I think Kill Lies All had that same effect on me. The grief that's going on, the overwhelming grief of humanity is portrayed so well there in that painting, and something that we will all sadly probably experience in one way or another in our lives. Yeah.
No, I think of Ezra Pound's definition of the image. It sounds like you initially, even before you started writing poetry, responded to visual imagery, what you said about cutting out those pictures from magazines. to help
Mhm.
you sort of return to the world in a way and find language. He defined the image as an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So you've
Mhm.
got both your mind and your heart coming together in response to a strong image. And so there's so much strong imagery in your work and your response, and also poems about art, and mainly I would say classical art, but probably you have a poem about Rothko in there as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
So could you talk about that marriage in your work between the visual image and art in particular, and the language that you've found in response? Do you ever find the language just veering off on its own into some other area that is foreign from the image?
Oh, you mean in the literal, like a very literal sense, like another world outside of the visual like
Y-
world, or just um
Yeah. Does your response to the art, I guess another way of putting it, does your response to the art ever find you, surprising yourself with language that you maybe wouldn't have found if you hadn't started writing about the art?
Yes, yeah, I think and I think it's I think the origins of all that's interesting for me, in that so I don't know why I have degrees in English. I always joke about this, that I'm dyslexic. So English was a really difficult subject for me all
Uh-huh.
my life, but I loved it. And I loved the image. And I asked my students this, I said, don't you have a movie running through your head whenever you read? Don't you have the visual, like,
Hmm.
don't you create the visual in your mind? And I did a poll on that very early when I was teaching high school, and many students who didn't like reading said no, they didn't. So I thought that was an interesting, as maybe a telling fact. But for me, that was the case. So I guess I loved the image that the words created enough to stick with it all those years.
Yeah.
And then when I was teaching art history was just so natural to me because it was so visual. And so being somebody who has issues with words and difficulties like finding the right word or getting lost in a word. But I also think, so the art history gave me, I think the visual of the art gave me that language, like you were just saying, for the words that I couldn't find
Mm,
sometimes. They were
mm,
really always easy for me to find in talking about describing visual art, mainly because I wasn't creating that art,
mm,
like I'm talking about that art. And then so it's a maybe different type of language. But then if I can apply that to something that I'm talking about completely separate from the visual art, like my
mm.
own personal grief, like when a piece of art like Guernica, which I'm pointing to, but no one can see, I'm pointing to the poem in my book, Guernica becomes a representation or metaphor for what's going on in my own
I
life.
think you say it's like
Then
etched
it's, yeah.
across your cheek or something, the Guernica in the poem.
Yes. I mean, I don't know when you want me to, I feel bad talking about it and not reading it. Should I read it,
It's a
or
pretty short poem, so yeah,
it's really,
go ahead.
yeah,
Go ahead and read.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Kill lies all. After his death, my hair did not grow. My nails peeled and flaked. My bones were lifted into a sack upon my legs. Even my muscles decayed from the lack of wild oranges and sweet tea. This was the new myth of my life. When visiting Spain, a cricket was loose in my kitchen. Its chirp was like my name, like the word yes, yes. But what could a dead woman know of yes? That summer, one cricket became two, two became four. It was then I memorized the trill and grind of my name. Like a vandal with a can of red spray paint, I could scrawl the words kill, lies, all across my Guernica. Who will be the bull, the horse? Who the severed head and arm? Under the bald lamp, like an eye, I will expose old scars and breastfeed a shadow of myself.
Mm, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Um, I'm going to ask you about the paradox of grief, if I could.
Sure.
Um, so you you lived in this world of the kind of cocoon of grief and silence for a long time, probably unable to write about it.
Mhm.
There are these other lines from Gilgamesh that really seem to resonate when I read your poetry. he describes, or Mason describes through the voice of the chorus in following Enkidu's death, the experience of his Gilgamesh's grief. He says it is that inner atmosphere that has an unfamiliar gravity or none at all, where words are flung out into the air but stay motionless without an answer, hovering about one's lips or arguing back to haunt the memory with what one failed to say until one learns acceptance of the silence amidst the new debris, or turns again to grief as the only source of privacy, alone with someone loved.
Yeah, that's that's the section I was thinking of when I was talking about that, alone with something, when someone loved. Yeah.
So there's something interestingly paradoxical about grief, in the sense that when you're working through it, that it becomes a kind of source of strength itself, as far as just experiencing it, going through this process where you can't say anything at first, really, especially maybe poetically, but then find these amazing words that connect with other people, as private as they are, right? And that cause people to come up to you and say, I need that poem. Send that poem to me.
Yeah. It's when initially, like I said, initially I didn't think I could get through it. And I think I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that way with with death and tragedy. And it's not that any death and any tragedy, there's any ranking of this, but I never saw Gary's suicide. I never saw it coming. And so it was truly so unexpected. And so I didn't think I was going to make it through. I just didn't. But I had a son who I needed to be strong for. And then, like you said, you start turning to, I think Kevin Young's collection on grief had just came out. I mean, it was right at that same time. And that was really important to me. He just lost his father not too long before, so he was collecting all these poems,
anthology,
and sorrow, different anthology on that. Yeah, that's what I meant. And that was really important to me, because then it created a group, a kindred people. You don't feel so alone, like you were saying. And and then it starts, like you said, the weird part becomes, then it morphs into something. For me, I went from writing truly about those experiences to the residue of those experiences, which is now my interest in what's the purpose of life? What is the point? Why do we keep going? Why do we wake up every day and write poems? When I look at the stars last night and listen to the coyotes outside, what's bigger than that? What's better than that?
Right.
And so now, not going through that experience, as like I said, that it's interesting. I guess residue might not be the right word, but there's still that, it's still there. Like one of my poems, Moonchar, talks about that. It never, ever, ever goes away, but now it informs everything I think and do. And every experience I have in my life, it informs that. For better or for worse. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. There's that other poem that I thought that I think speaks to that very strongly. It's called Leah Beach.
Oh, okay.
Again, it's a short poem that I think reflects what you just said.
I can read it. When I was thinking about how the book comes to be, what outside of just the personal tragedy, but what else influences our work? What else kind of helps mold this piece of art, right? That I ended up with, this 80-page piece of art, or however many, I don't even know, 74 page. Anyway, geography is really important to me. Like I was, here in Rochester writing about the surrounding forest. Ancient geography and parts of the ancient world are also super important to me. And I went to Greece not long after my husband's suicide. It was a trip of kind of it was a rebirth trip in a way, where I was on an island and it was so mythic in itself. But I turned to the ancient world, Gilgamesh, ancient Greece, even Europe, even like ancient old churches in Europe, because it makes me remember, helps me to remember that, again, I'm not alone, that how many hundreds of thousands of years have people been thinking and experiencing this one thing I did. So Anyway, Leah Beach is a beach on the island of Serifos, in the Cycladic Islands. No gulls arrive. The waves on the beach are fluted and clocked. Bathers stop at the edge, take off their clothes. A woman collects the trash. Nightfall will come and the shore will close without leaving a message. I crouch in the perfect hour, but cannot decide what road to take. My neck is burnt from the day's sun. My shirt is balled in my fist, and I collect shells like a pilgrim, trying to buy my way home. But there is only one path, and there is no home.
Wow, thanks. When you say no home, I hear you thinking or meaning that in a figurative way. Am I correct
Yes.
in interpreting that that you are you thinking specifically of your old home there, or just your state of being as a kind of restless wanderer at that point?
That's a great question. A little of both in a way. I was living in Florida. I lived in Florida for 40 years before moving to Vermont. My husband was a native Floridian, which is actually used to be when we were kids, kind of an unusual person because everyone was from somewhere else in Florida, and so to be born and raised in Florida both is unusual. Right. And so, yeah, I felt because of his connection, his deep family connections to Florida. Florida was no longer going to be my home. It was too difficult. Plus, I moved to Vermont, which I immediately fell in love with, and immediately had the joy of discovering all the things I never knew of, like chickadees and things, like birds that we don't have in Florida, and snow and all the different forms of snow. But it's also like the not going home again, not having a home. I will always be this now. Like this is I'm a new me. Again, like I said, for better or for worse, whatever that is, but I have no home. I've now been given the task of the wanderer through life with this. And I didn't realize when I was writing the book came out in 2020, but I started writing it, back in, some of the poems are as old as probably 2012, not too long after his death. It takes forever to put these things together. And so now with retrospect, of course, I feel like I'm much further along that path that I mentioned. Still maybe a little homeless for that reason, but I shouldn't probably say homeless for lack of that for the context of not being sensitive, but you know what I mean.
Metaphorically.
Yeah,
yes.
Metaphorically.
So poetic language in particular help you reconnect to the world and to other people around you after being pretty isolated or lonely. Alone maybe is the better word for what, a year or more at least, I'm sure. And you were then slowly able to live again in a way that was hopeful, I guess is maybe the best word, right? And you fell in love again. You married Major Jackson. You have a new life with Major in Tennessee, in Nashville, and also here in Vermont. So we think of you still as a Vermonter, by the way.
Yes. Okay, good. Good.
And you have this wonderful poem about with Major on Hawk Mountain, which is kind of an affirmation of that new life. And maybe you could read that and talk about it a little.
Sure, happily. This was one of the later poems that went in. And I don't know exactly when I wrote it, but it was one of so I had my earlier poems that were dealing with the actual subject of suicide. And then of course, as I had that middle period where I felt like I had that mythic time on that island. I know I'm not alone. I was reading, Linda, right? Yes, and I was reading Linda Gregg, and while I was there, so
Jack Gilbert too.
Yeah, I'm not alone in the effects of Greece on poets. And that poem, by the way, Leah Beach, that whole section was heavily influenced by Ritsos, who Ritsos is one of my who I discovered, but one of my favorite poets. But this one's a later one, and I still am even sitting here, and I have the wings of some of the monarchs that I would find
Mhm.
you know, smashed in the road, I would still take them home even though they were smashed, and kind of look at them. So anyway, and Hawk Mountain is here where we are. So with Major on Hawk Mountain. In the early evening, the sky blushes at our close attention. We can't take our eyes off of it as two mourning doves lift and land near our empty feeder, paired for life. The male lilts a coo. His breast mirrors the pink above us. I begin to hum a song, something about icons and suitcases. Last summer, I collected the dead monarch that now rests like a medieval relic on the yellow paper on my desk. One wing is split in two, a female with thick coal veins and no black dot on the hind wings, like Tiffany glass, all fire and pitch. The milkweed she ate all summer turned her blood to poison for her predators. Now her wings are as brittle as the book pages left in the rain, dried in the sun. The summer my previous husband took his life, I thought each monarch in our garden was a sign. Not so. Dead is dead. The flush mountains now look as if they want a short nap, might come to life later with the moonlight. Even the dove has quieted into his shared nest.
Mm, very nice.
Thank you. Thanks.
But yeah, butterflies play this big role in a lot of your poems, in their wings. What attracts you to them? What kind of both literal and metaphorical significance do they have for you?
I know the moths, well,
And moths too.
moths, I know. Winged creatures,
Birds.
the birds. During the pandemic, I think we all became bird watchers, really close bird watchers. I've always been super, super interested in the natural world. Growing up in Florida, we had a lake in my backyard, and I would run down barefoot through the grass to the lake, moccasins, alligators, whatever might be down there. I was super interested in seeing and exploring. And again, I was a child of that generation where we just went outside and just stayed outside until dusk. And my parents had no idea where I was. I could have been eaten by an alligator for all they knew.
Yeah.
And so I'm really, really interested in that. And what I found recently, I always wanted to write about the natural world, but I didn't quite know how to enter into it. And with what I've discovered about what I'm kind of working on, particularly in my next book, but it's certainly in Moonjar, that world gives me a language also, like visual art. The natural world gives me this language, a vocabulary for which to continue to express maybe my grief and mourning, but also this interest in life and death, because the natural world, I mean, the beauty of, I'm pointing over here because the monarch is literally on this banister right next to me, smashed, but it gave me an opportunity to look carefully at its wings. So its beauty and death, again, this beauty and death is just really interesting and fascinating to me. Yeah, and I found that monarchs or butterflies in general puddle, and they're doing is they're kind of drinking the amino acids getting it from the roadsides, the dirt roads, and the water, and things like that are just utterly fascinating to me. And then they might be very common knowledge to some people, but all that, is it's just beautiful. And I want to take it all in, and I want to like process it through my work, and then just put it out there for everybody to kind of get a little bit of, I guess.
Right. So you feel, I sense, rejuvenated by your work. I mean, you've just gotten back from Greece, and probably I mean, you went back under different circumstances this time, and was wondering and you went with Major, and I should we should just tell everybody that we miss Major.
I will let him know. I will tell him.
Will you let him know?
He misses Vermont terribly, but
yeah.
I mean, our goal is to be back up here. I mean, we love Nashville, we love Vanderbilt, and it was a wonderful semester last semester. But
it was a job you both couldn't we know that. And
Didi
Jackson, I should just say, is a major American poet who lived in Vermont for many years and taught at the University of Vermont. And really was an invaluable poetic presence in Vermont, and is now also in Tennessee, but he's back here, what, 3 or 4 months out of the year? So
I mean, yeah, so this
we're
summer we're
happy.
plans, yeah, to
Oh,
be
good.
here.
We're
Yeah.
happy. We're very happy
Yeah.
about that. So your poetry sort of chronicles this, but could you talk maybe just a little bit about uh, that return to love? I mean, it must have been
Mhm.
pretty difficult for you. And I'm
Mhm.
just guessing. I mean, I think that when you fall in love, the world is miraculous. And the fact that that happened for you again is miraculous, it seems, in some ways. Anyway.
Yeah, I believe in love, apparently. Um, I have had women in my life who are my role models. My mother and my aunt both were widowed. My mother very young, and they were able to be there for me through that and give me hope and a promise of a life to come. They were both living models of that.
Mm-hmm.
My
Mm-hmm.
aunt, my great aunt, is the woman who is a role model for me, who's 93, and she lives in outside of Asheville, North Carolina. So I live a little closer to her, though with COVID, we weren't able to go see her, but I'm hoping that I can get over there. So I always, I tell I want to be that role model that they were for me, for my son. I want him to know that, things might seem dark one day, but odds are they're going to feel different in a couple of days, if not a little longer, but hang
Mm-hmm.
in there. Life, and I always tell him the flip side of that is when you're really up and joyful in the middle of immense joy, there's probably going to be around the corner. It's not, I hate to say this, but some tough times, so
Yeah.
it's just this constant,
Yeah.
and as long as you're aware of that and know that that's the way it's going to work, you can do it, you can handle it. So, but finding new love, I mean, it wasn't too hard to fall in love with Major.
Oh, he made
And
it.
we were on a Greek island,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's the logistics of it. I didn't want to move my son from Florida, so we lived apart for almost 4.5 years. We traveled back and forth between Florida
Wow.
and Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because there was all of the just regular life stuff that was in the middle of all that. And but it's been wonderful. And it's really interesting, us both being poets
Right.
and
That
being
doesn't
able to
always work,
share.
though. Yeah.
No, and being able to share the poetic life, being able to understand, okay, I'm going to go up into my office and I'll see you in a couple of hours,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that's or us fighting, we're out in nature and we see something and we're like, who's going to write about it first,
Yeah.
when we're
Yeah.
walking. So or in Greece, I think we both
Yeah.
had some things that we wrote about equally or differently,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
fascinating. I'm so happy for you. And
Okay.
Major too.
Yeah, thank you.
There are a lot of religious themes in your poems.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of your poems have religious titles like Annunciation and Iconoclasm and names of saints and so forth.
Yeah.
And I sense that you grew up in a pretty strong religious family. And I'm curious to know just how religion plays or played and plays a role as a kind of muse in your work.
Yeah, it's funny. My dad my dad is going to be the subject of the book I'm kind of working on now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I'll get to that. I want to make sure I answer the question, but he was born in Tennessee, he was born in Clarksville. And I found when I moved to Nashville and was unpacking boxes, I found out that I knew his family was very, very poor. But he had a sister who died, and I didn't know about this, and is buried in an unmarked grave because they were too poor to give her a headstone. So he's the subject of my next collection. And he grew up in Appalachia and wanted to be a preacher. Thought he was going to be a preacher. Ends up life changed and completely took him a different route. And so I didn't really grow up in a super religious home. I mean, we went to church. They were going to Luther, but then we lived in Ohio. I was born in Ohio. But I fell in love. I don't follow one particular religion. I love everything about the ideas of spirituality, I definitely believe that there's something greater than myself, but I don't claim to know I don't have the answers. I don't personally have the answers. I'm really open to that. But that said, through teaching art history, I just fell in love with the centuries of spiritual art. I adore it, and I adore the stories. I absorb those, and they've become part of something that I also see, again, humanity's joys and humanity's sorrows reflected in.
Yeah.
So much so, like I did write when I was in Greece, and in this little town we were in Bambuko, had a church, and it was just covered. It was a Greek Orthodox church, and it was just covered wall to wall with images. They paint every single inch. It's all didactic. It's gorgeous. But I'm in the church, I'm sitting there, and I was allowed to go in alone. It was just also a very beautiful moment and experience. It's very quiet, and the incense, and it was just me, and it was dark, and I'm in this with all these images on the walls. But there's the image of one of the saints being beheaded, or there's one of the saints his hands being cut off. And I know, but it's all this like really horrible, violence against these people who died for their faith. They're willing to go give the ultimate sacrifice for their faith, and I'm really, really interested in that. So yeah, it just I think it's because I admire it. I don't claim it because I don't necessarily practice one in particular. One particular. What would you say? I'm saying in my head it's genre, but that's only because I'm in literary mode. One in particular faith, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Right.
Yeah. So it does find its way. Yeah.
And yet and yet in some of your poems, you question and you rub up against the whole idea of religion in a way that's provocative and inspiring, really. At the same time, your poem Iconoclasm is like that. And I think that would be a wonderful one to read if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Gosh, I haven't read this one out loud very much, so that's great. I'm glad to do that. Yeah, and I don't think. I think I explained like half the things I'm talking about. The Merode altarpiece has these always. The other thing I love about I love about visual art, particularly I love like the early Northern Renaissance period. It's been my favorite period because I love all the things that are symbols for something, because I feel like it's a puzzle that I'm unlocking, so, the easy ones like the lily, but there's a copper pot, or there's a key, or, there's all these different things that can become symbols for something. A walnut, what's the walnut a symbol for? So,
right.
But so I mentioned Merode altarpiece, but I think I explain it kind of in the poem. So, iconoclasm. I approached the task of destroying images by first tearing them out of the heart. Martin Luther. Sorry, yeah, that was a epigraph. Yeah. We share a like-mindedness that grows tall and bends at the ceiling, like a mantra, like liturgy, like the global hum of hunger. Taking whatever comes and taking it again and again, the godliness of winter, the sinfulness of summer, we lay it all down. We gloss over the fable where the girl falls into an endless sleep, because we both know death rested here, rested and waited a while, looking for other scraps, earthly and of flesh, but eventually moved on. In the night, I spoke of his suicide, the shame of it, his jaundiced eyes, the betrayal, the husband no longer husband, me belted to a narrative I didn't want, the lash of the memory of love, the drenching of new love, of flesh and bone, of kiss and kick. I'll bake and knit and keep a house more precious than any house, that I may place a prayer book open in my lap as I recline by the cold fireplace like Mary in Campion's Merode altarpiece. No one will provide a bench and a brass kettle, but you might equip me with the myth of purient lovers who, over time, find the smallest detail of the other's body irresistible. My freckle, my thighs curve. I've been watching the grackles, and now it's almost dark. A light source allies us with the Dutch masters. We gaze easily over the fire at each other. In the small rooms of our hearts, we both hide the false gods of our past lives.
You pack that poem with so much.
Yeah. I know. I kind of move around in that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You called it iconoclasm because, what would you say?
Well, it's funny because the early Dutch Renaissance, they're not worrying about that, or the early, the early Dutch, or even the early Northern, because it's not necessarily, those regions are still moving around. Some areas were owned by Spain. They were very Catholic, very attuned to painting all the things. And then, of course, slowly with the onset of Lutheranism and other Calvinism and such, they start destroying, the paintings. The churches had to be whitewashed. So I'm thinking of the Protestant iconoclasm, and then just what we whitewash in our own ways from our own lives as you're coming with, it's kind of scary sharing all the details of your life with this person that you're coming to know and learning to love. And so what we personally, how would I verb it? Iconoclast, that's a noun, iconoclasm. Anyway,
that's correct.
what we destroy or what we whitewash in our own lives.
Absolutely. You've got a more contemporary one, poem about Rothko, which is a prose poem. And people often talk about the religious experience they have viewing Rothko, but not in a traditional sense. So you leap ahead to the 20th century in that poem. Was there something particularly inspirational to you about Rothko?
Well, Rothko is near and dear to me because he too committed suicide. He was on some, I think, really heavy and experimental, maybe antidepressants, and then was drinking heavily. And but he is somebody whose work I loved and have always loved. And I too, although I haven't wept at the foot of a Rothko painting, not necessarily personally, but I know I've heard people do. I love his work. And so because he died of suicide, and because I love Rothko so much, and because I was sitting in Maine, again, that influence of geography for me, and the colors of Maine looked like this one particular Rothko that I was familiar with. It all just kind of comes together from there. And and so my own personal experience with that.
You've probably been giving a fair number of readings, I would assume, in
Nashville. I mean, with COVID, the 2020 books kind of but a lot of Zoom. Thank goodness for Zoom. Thank goodness that we have it.
I'm curious. I'm curious about this also. The poetry seems pretty balkanized in America. There are the poets, and there are those who read poetry, and there are the universities where poetry is taught in English classes, and so forth. But it's not really in the bloodstream of most Americans. Poetry doesn't serve as a kind of history or as a kind of bellwether or literature that continues to enlighten. Despite what Whitman said back in the 20th century about the American people being the greatest poem of all. When you're reading or when you're talking to people about poetry, what do you say about? I mean, a lot of them are attending your readings because they want to hear about your experience and your themes and ideas and so forth. And of course, you teach now at Vanderbilt, and you taught at UVM as well. What do you say to students about poetry as a kind of vital source of literature and of just communication that is so vital for us as citizens to pay attention to?
Well, I have a history teaching high school also, and I feel that as a high school teacher, I was I honed my skills at convincing students often of the thing that I adore and love. High school students are the most, or often can be, not always, some of the most resistant to anything someone my age wants to tell them that's a really great thing.
Yeah.
And so I had that experience already with art history, particularly.
Yeah.
I loved teaching art history to high school. I taught art history to high school students. I taught AP art history. I loved it. It was some of my favorite times in my life, and I'm still very close with many of those students. And I always joke that if I had a dime for every student who went on to minor in art history, a lot of them didn't major in art history, but a lot of them minored, I would not be really rich, but I would be richer.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I have I still have that same conversation in a way with poetry. The classes that I teach at the college level are often classes where someone's chosen to take that class, though, you know, so I don't have to really know. And that was the same way with the art history course. So, you know, it was an elective, and the creative writing course, you know, people often want to get in, they're trying to get into the course, or like a course, intro to poetry, which I just finished teaching this past semester. You know, they kind of knew what they were getting into. So I don't feel like I had to really convince them of any importance for the genre of poetry. And I find that they really end up really loving it. And I so much so I stay in communication with them, and they'll send me back, oh, I saw this, or did you see that? Or, you know, they want to let me know that they too are going out in the world. One of the courses I taught at UVM was an intro to poetry course. And I told them over and over again, my ultimate goal, besides you knowing how to identify metaphor and how for you to scan a line, but my ultimate goal is for you to be a reader of poetry. And I do feel like those were, I taught those often, a couple times. I love teaching that, because I really just want them to see that they too can access poetry, that they can read, they can find their poems. Do I like every single poem that I come across in my life? No, I don't love every single poem. I might appreciate this or that about it, but they can find their poems that they're going to love, and also showing them like resources to find them. You know, like, you know, about, you know, I know it's hard. I mean, I love Vermont for all the bookstores, and all the poetry sections of the bookstores are usually weighty. You know, that's not the case everywhere across the country, and so, you know, where else can they find poems, and how can they find the poems that might resonate with them in that moment? And I also remind them that they're gonna like, I mean, there are poems that I didn't like when I was 20 that I love now that I'm 51, you know, like, you know, life experience also informs some of those things. So I guess,
that's a great answer. Did you know that there are more poets and writers per capita in Vermont than any other state in the country?
I'm not surprised. I love it.
So
I love that.
We're spoiled here. There are a few questions, but I would love you to maybe close with a reading of Moonjar, and talk about the poem itself. You know, why you titled the book Moonjar, and what it means metaphorically. I think it's pretty obvious, but maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Sure. I did notice that I had quite a few jar images before I even wrote I didn't start off with the title of the book Moonjar, you know. That poem kind of came as the book was being put together. But I did notice that I had several different also jar images. Not only do I have a lot of winged images, you know, birds and moths and things, butterflies, but I also had different jar moments. And so I was teaching how to write about art course at UVM, and it was a kind of a first year writing course where you know, you're learning all the elements of writing, but this was just about art only. It was kind of a special little niche course that I was able to do. And I was looking at this, and this one book had a moon jar in it that we started talking about. And even though I was teaching art history, I never really came across the idea of the moon jar. It was, you know, and it was slightly new to me. And the beauty of, I know about like art that you know, certain cultures is beloved for its imperfection. I know about that, but particularly the moon jar, and it's just gorgeous, and they're often gigantic. You know, they can be little in the contemporary world. They can be very small too, but and to see the process of making one, and then made in two separate hemispheres, or made separately, and then brought together, and then fired, and then the desire, all the imperfections that happens in the firing is beloved, to beloved something for its imperfection. It was just, I just fell in love with the idea and the image. So I wanted to write a poem about a moon jar, and I wanted to title my book Moon Jar, because I was thinking about, you know, anybody who has struggled with depression, and my late husband, if maybe he could have known whatever it was that he felt he could not overcome, he could not get past, whatever it was that he felt, the world, whoever it was that would not ever forgive him or be able to accept him, or whatever that is that we're all walking around with, if we could figure out how to, at the very first step, accept, but in the very end, love our imperfections, like understand and love them. So that's why I just love the moon jar. So that's where the idea of the book came from. And it was for him, but also for me, and then for any reader, anybody who reads the book, and hoping they too could come to love their imperfections. So moon jar. My wedding ring is missing. Oh, and this is true. This part is true. My wedding ring is missing one small diamond, and I like it that way. A reminder of the imperfect in all of us, like that keyhole size of grief that remains crystalline. In Korea, ceramicists for centuries have made moon jars, testimony to the virtue of modesty, asymmetrical warping on the wheel, slumping in the pine-heated kiln, impurities when fired, black dots and pocks on its surface like freckles on skin. I have been kept awake so many nights by the moon, its pull on the pines and night birds, and who, like a monk, keeps a sharp order of time. Never a perfect sphere, the milky moon jar joins two clay hemispheres into one. When the light of the moon finds me, I am the color of everything in the winter night.
Wow. So, you know, you end on a note of just amazing, almost an epiphany of who you are as a whole, which comes close to the definition of perfection, but it's again a kind of an irony that imperfection has led you there. That's really important poem for you to read.
Thank you.
I'm just looking here, Didi, at the questions. There was one question here about, well, someone really wanted to know what were your early experiences with writing, and when did you first start writing poetry? We only have just a couple of minutes, so.
Oh, sure. I loved poetry ever since I was a little kid. It made more sense to me, and it was easier for me with being dyslexic than, novels, and so poetry made a lot of sense. And so I was writing poetry as a little kid, but I didn't start seriously until college. As an undergrad, I took poetry classes at University of Florida, where's my undergrad, and then I did a master's that was in English, but then I did an MFA. So it's always been a part of something I've been really, really interested in. Is
do you know how many dyslexic poets are out there?
I can imagine.
Well, Yeats was terribly dyslexic. Robert Lowell was dyslexic. They couldn't spell their name practically. So it's just.
Try Didi being dyslexic. D-I-D-I. I was often D-I-B-I. My own name. It's kind of true.
That's fascinating. Well, we're actually coming right up on 6 o'clock. It's 5:59.
Okay.
So it's just been so wonderful talking to you. And
thank you. And thanks for all your questions, Chard. Thank you. It was just such a great discussion. I really
kind of flew
really
by. We could talk another couple hours, and
we could.
So please do give my best to Major, and I hope that while you're here in Vermont that you can visit old friends and enjoy this summer, before it just flies by. Like it's doing more and more so these days.
Yes.
And have a wonderful year back in Nashville. And
thank you.
And we look forward to you returning every summer.
Thank you. We'll be here.
Thank you, Didi.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you.
great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So next month on September 10th, the cocktail hour is going to happen at 7 p.m. instead of 5 because 2 of the 4 writers are on the West Coast. They're all female memoirists, including Kima Waterfield, Gina Troesi, Sari Fordham, and Megan Colhane Galbraith. So until then, stay safe and, mask up.
Thank you, Sandy.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.